Hello, I'm Leslie Dannon Rosenthal, Chair of the Board of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. For those of you new to JCPA, our mission is to strengthen and leverage the Jewish community relations network across the nation to champion a just, democratic, and pluralistic society and advance the right of full inclusion of all members of our society, including Jews, free of discrimination, hate, and prejudice. The overarching strategy of the JCPA and Jewish community relations councils around the country recognizes that our safety as Jews is found in relationship and partnership with diverse communities. The October 7th attacks in Israel and the ensuing rise in anti-Semitism and hate across the United States and the rest of the world has put those relationships under new forms of pressure and stress. Today's webinar will enable us to dig more deeply into the critical need for community relations now more than ever. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. Judah Ari Gross will be our moderator. Judah's recent eJewishPhilanthropy article titled Stress Test for JCRC's Strategy in Wake of Hamas Attacks brilliantly laid the groundwork for today's conversation. Judah is the news editor at eJewishPhilanthropy. Prior to joining EJP, he was a reporter for the Times of Israel, covering Israel diaspora affairs, religion, and the military. He's a graduate of the University of Maryland College Park and Haifa University and lives with his family in Zichron Yaakov, Israel. Amy Spitalnick is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, the national convener of Jewish coalitions working across communities to build a just and inclusive American democracy. She previously served as executive director of Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. Jeremy Burton has been the CEO of the JCRC of Greater Boston since 2011, after playing leadership roles in many Jewish organizations, as well as government and political campaigns. Previously, Jeremy was the Senior Vice President of Programs at Jewish Funds for Justice and Vice President of Programs at the Jewish Funders Network. Tyler Gregory has been the CEO of the JCRC Bay Area since 2020. Previously, he served as executive director of A Wider Bridge, the LGBTQ+ organization advancing equality in Israel through international support and cooperation. Judah, it's up to you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. I see we've got a pretty full crowd. So before I get started with some questions of my own for our panelists, I want to encourage everyone, we have a Q&A feature. You can submit questions. We'll try to get to them as we can. Hopefully the questions that I ask will also cover some of the questions that you folks have. But please, if you have anything specific, please send it that way. So I'll start with Amy. Sort of you came in as the CEO of JCPA as part of this overall strategy, focusing more on coalition building, moving away from the previous consensus model. So there's sort of growing calls within the Jewish community and within Jewish advocacy groups to take some more aggressive approaches, away from playing nice and making friends and towards, going after people that are coming for the Jewish community. And sort of, I'd like to hear a little bit how you see the coalition building model playing out, what successes it's had, and what challenges it's been facing.
Absolutely. And thanks so much, Judah, for being with us today and the really robust crowd that we have. Grateful to folks for taking time out of their holiday week to have this conversation. Look, at the end of the day, coalition building and fighting anti-Semitism are one and the same. We can't do one without the other, and we certainly can't fight anti-Semitism alone. And it's that understanding that is at the core of JCPA and the JCRC's work, that we as Jews are safest in inclusive, pluralistic societies where we're in deep relationship with our neighbors. And those relationships mean that we can both call things out when need be, certainly as we've seen over the last 6 weeks, but also be building those coalitions to advance the long-term vision for our society in which we know Jews and so many others are safest. As you mentioned, I just started this role. I started full-time September 5th, which was quite a time to start a job leading a national Jewish organization. And that role came with a mandate that came out of JCPA's really extensive conversations with the JCRC field, with local federation leaders, with other Jewish community leaders and partners, to build coalitions rooted in the idea of protecting and advancing democracy and combating anti-Semitism and other deeply interconnected forms of hate. And that vision is rooted in an understanding of both the very real threats to our democracy and to Jews and so many other communities, which we know certainly predate October 7th. This was a crisis long before October 7th. And also the understanding that in protecting and advancing democracy and fighting hate, we not only move forward the sort of society in which we know we are safest, but we're actually able to build those relationships across lines of difference so that in moments like this, those relationships exist and are in place, and can continue to be strengthened. And yet, I think to your point, there are some who are telling us that in this moment, we need to give up on that vision, that we need to default to a maybe particularist approach to effectively fight for ourselves alone, to refuse to overcome lines of difference, to not believe in the sort of shared future in which Jews in all communities are finally safe. And I just don't buy that. We should make no mistake that there are very real challenges and fissures that were made clear in the aftermath of October 7th. I know I am, and so many others are feeling deeply abandoned and isolated in certain coalition spaces where we've long shown up as partners and allies. And this is hurtful, it is painful. In some cases, this has been simply manifested in sort of the silence of partners. In other cases, it has gone well beyond that to overt, hurtful, problematic, and even anti-Semitic comments in certain spaces. But we should also know that for every either silent partner organization or hurtful tweet or statement, there have been so many others who have spoken out and who have actually shown up in allyship with our communities. And so how we move forward, I think, requires a clear diagnosis of what the problem is, of the complex nature of what has actually happened since October 7th. And it means understanding the ways in which this anti-Semitism is actually manifesting in these different spaces. It means understanding how on the left, for example, this is rooted in perhaps a fundamental lack of shared understanding of what anti-Semitism is, that in turn gives way to actual acceptance of anti-Semitism, particularly as it relates to Israel. Jews are not seen or understood as a marginalized community, and that is at odds with so many of the traditional dynamics of race and power. How can Jews be victims when we're so successful, right? And so all of this has the effect of isolating and alienating Jews from the very coalitions we need to be building at this moment where we're facing rising extremism and hate. And on the right, we're seeing this manifest in deliberate efforts to pit communities against one another, suggesting that the fight for one community's safety somehow comes at the expense of another's. And this is manifesting in, for example, increasingly normalized anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement. All of that is intended to further divide our communities at a time when we know that allyship and coalitions are more urgent than ever. And so in this moment, our job is to reject this false binary that's being pushed at us from every direction, because we have no option but to find a path forward, to continue building bridges and coalitions however possible, and to keep pursuing the sort of inclusive, pluralistic, shared future that we know is inherent to our own safety as Jews. And so for me, this all makes the work of JCPA and the JCRCs even more urgent than ever, while holding the complexity, holding the pain and the grief that we have really experienced over the last 6 weeks, but not losing sight of this dire need to continue to build those bridges and those relationships, which again, in this moment are more urgent than ever.
Thank you. So I'm going to sort of follow up through Jeremy, and I'll follow up through Jeremy, and then we'll jump to Ty, because I think there was something in terms of coalition building, sort of the JCRC in Boston, specifically within the Jewish community, had a bit of a split within its coalition in terms of the workers' circle, and sort of where you see, alongside both within, sort of internally within the Jewish community and then looking outward, where are red lines where you're no longer part of this group, you're no longer part of this coalition?
Well, thank you, Judah, and thank you everybody for being with us. Given that this is a national audience, I'm not going to assume that everybody is deeply familiar with the particular event you're referencing that played out here in Boston last month. So I'll just briefly say different JCRCs have different models of how we govern and structure. Ours, as an outside or independent JCRC, has its own governing structure outside of the Federation, which is a 40-member organization model. One of those member organizations, the Worker Circle, resigned as a member in the last few weeks in the face of a pending review of their membership eligibility. And I'll just briefly say, it's important to say that this is a 13-year conversation with them that actually started before I even arrived here, regarding the ongoing question of working specifically with Jewish Voice for Peace and specifically the legitimization of Jewish anti-Zionist organizations. And I am distinguishing that from, say, Muslim partners who don't support Zionism, but like specifically a Jewish organization that amplifies anti-Zionism and amplifies anti-Semitism as being an expression of non-alignment with the overall mission and purpose of a JCRC. And this has been an ongoing conversation. And I think what's important to say is that conversations about who belongs at Jewish communal tables have been going on for centuries. I mean, we can go back to the Talmud to talk about who belongs and who doesn't. For us as a field, this question of who needs to be at the table in order to have a robust collective advocacy and relationship building on behalf of the interests of the American Jewish community and civic space goes back to the founding of JCRCs in the 1940s. The events of the last 6 weeks have certainly sharpened some of our internal conversations about that. And I think there is going to be a larger realignment or reevaluation of coalitions we hold, the partners we hold, and frankly, some of our tolerance collectively as an American Jewish community for some of the behaviors in the boundaries of our community and in the far reaches and edges of our community in the coming year. We just happened in Boston because we've been having this conversation for over a decade. We had the fortune of going first.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, really, to also put it into a context, I mean, the Worker Circle also recently left the Conference of Presidents as a national organization as well. So I think that organization is also sort of seeing some of its own sort of internal realignment. But in terms of broader coalitions sort of outside the Jewish community, do you see, or do you have red lines of where that desire to be in relationship goes, no, this is a toxic relationship that we don't want to be a part of? And if so, where are those lines?
I'll only speak for us in Boston, but I think most CRCs have always had red lines. And there is this misconception that our field is willing to partner with anyone. And that is just not true. We have always had very clear lines about those who put anti-Semitism in one form or another at the center of their agenda, those who actively seek the dissolution of a Jewish state. There are other kinds of bigotry and that we draw a line on. We wouldn't work with a white supremacist group. We wouldn't work with a hate group. Those kinds of red lines have always existed. I won't iterate all of them. I will say for us, we constantly think about how do we define the boundaries between acceptable discourse, even uncomfortable discourse, and hate discourse or intolerable discourse, both within and beyond the Jewish community with our partners. And I will say, I don't think we've been terribly disappointed by most of our institutional partners in this moment. Some of them, we would have liked to have seen a more robust rebuttal of other intolerable behavior, but not intolerable behavior coming from our actual partners. What we're seeing are fringe groups that we don't work with saying intolerable things, and some of our partners maybe not having the public pushback that we'd like to see, and that's a more complicated conversation to have. But we're not seeing like close partners that we've been working with or people that we've been in real coalition with saying offensive, despicable things about Israel, about October 7th. I want to say by and large, there are probably a couple of exceptions if we went through the entire litany.
All right, Ty, in terms of you're obviously in an interesting part of the country. You recently had a bridge that was momentarily blocked as part of a protest. I wonder sort of if there's concern that sort of because there are organizations like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace that are coming as Jewish organizations and sort of very much putting that stamp on things, that sort of makes your work in some ways more difficult, that people can say, the Jews say that this is okay, and how you're able to relate to partners, we're the majority, we're the representative of the Jewish community, even though these groups might have Jewish in their name.
It's a great question. Thank you, Judah. And shout out to my colleagues here. I think for everyone watching, wherever you're from, it's not just each of us working. We are all partners. Jeremy and Amy and I, we have a text chain, and many of our other colleagues across the country. And I think of Boston and San Francisco in particular as, for those of you that are Game of Thrones fans, we're the Night's Watch. We're the first place where people are going to come with these negative trends, and it's our job to stop them before they spread to other parts of the country. And so whether that's what happened in Cambridge in Massachusetts last night, good job, or what we're dealing with on Monday at the Oakland City Council across the bay, these trends start here and quickly spread. So that's why it's important that our progressive corners of the country step up and stop these trends. The Bay Bridge, look, I think it was Napoleon that said, when your enemies are defeating themselves, get out of the way. I don't know how many commuters on the Bay Bridge were so thrilled that people, protested the APEC conference and threw their keys into the Bay. I think the SFPD should have pushed their cars after the keys into the Bay and let them deal with that, but never mind. I think that upset people. And the same thing with our Democratic convention in Sacramento, our state convention. They didn't just shut down the Jewish caucus, they shut down the API caucus and the LGBTQ caucus and, all the issues that the California Democratic Party care about. They shut the entire conference down, and they got a huge condemnation from the chair of the Democratic Party of California, saying that there would be consequences. So, I think it's important that our partners recognize that it's not just this issue that they're disrupting every other issue in our democracy and having an adverse effect. And so I think by showing that we're the rational players, we can sustain those partnerships because they see how counterproductive a lot of those actions truly are. Look, it's a challenging time, but as Amy and Jeremy have underscored, the mainstream institutions that we've been building relationships with all along are staying in line. Equality California, the single largest statewide organization, has been very supportive. We've had Black elected leaders, our mayor of San Francisco, our district attorney, moderate Black leaders in the East Bay. They've all been very supportive. And so I sort of reject this notion that people of color or certain progressive constituencies are not with us. The ones that we build relationships with that have the credibility have been supportive. To Jeremy's point, maybe they're not as vocal on everything because they have diverse constituents, but they have remained our partners. And it's really about keeping that far left. I don't like calling them progressives. I think they're leftists and regressives that are trying to undermine our democracy. It's about making sure that camp that is openly anti-Semitic stays there and doesn't creep into the mainstream left in the same way Amy's good work on the, combating the far right, making sure that doesn't seep into the mainstream of the Republican Party with mixed results. That's not on you, Amy. But that's what we think our job is here. And overall, I don't think there have been big surprises as to where people have fallen. And that's thanks to decades of work that all of us have been doing.
Right. If we can go a little bit more into some of the specific areas where you all have had successes and less so and more challenges. I think one of the areas where, at least sort of on a I don't know, you can say superficial level, more than that, not just superficial, but on a very sort of clear and explicit level, you've had a lot of successes with at least national politicians, but sort of where things have been in terms of your relationships, sort of each of your relationships with elected officials, both sort of national and state and city, I guess, for you folks. Amy, do you want to start? I mean, you can start more on the Washington side. Yeah, start on the Washington side, I guess.
Yeah, look, I think it's so easy for us to feel, in deep pain and abandonment right now, as we've been talking about, right? And I think there are many efforts, as I talked about earlier, to make us feel that way, to make it feel like we are isolated and alone. But if you actually look at the reaction of national officials across the board, from the White House to Congress to the all of these cabinet secretaries and agencies that have been stepping up, it has been remarkable. I was at that White House meeting a few days after October 7th. It was originally convened as a meeting to discuss the historic national strategy to combat anti-Semitism that came out in May, which in and of itself should be a reminder that this government has our back, that the administration has our back, and put forward this deeply comprehensive strategy. And it turned into a conversation on October 7th and the expected aftermath, in which the president's moral clarity was remarkable, in which he made clear that he understood the pain and the grief that was felt in that room. And he and his administration have shown up every step of the way. I've been fortunate to be a part of conversations with the Attorney General and the FBI Director and the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Ed. And all of these officials have repeatedly made clear that they have the Jewish community's back in this moment. They are not going to let those who are sowing hate and fear and bigotry on college campuses or in our communities succeed. And of course, that doesn't mean that they are doing every single thing that every single one of us might like to see on a daily basis. It wouldn't be government and it wouldn't be politics if that were the case. But we are absolutely seeing on the federal level a real rallying of resources, of moral clarity in the bully pulpit to show up for the Jewish community in a way that feels deeply important right now. And I think it's important to understand that, what showing up means. Certainly, I think the president has led with deep moral clarity, particularly in talking about how deeply personal this is for him, talking about his families, how he brings his family to visit concentration camps, and he learned firsthand the very real impact of anti-Semitism. But for a variety of elected officials, whether they are members of Congress or others, we're not going to necessarily see someone put out a statement that says exactly what we would say if we had written those statements. And for me, that should not be the goal. The goal should be our elected officials hitting the key points that we think are crucial to understanding the pain and the grief and the concerns of this moment. Are they calling out anti-Semitism unequivocally? Are they making clear that what happened in Israel on October 7th was a terror attack that was unjustified? Are they calling for the release of the hostages? And so making sure that we actually have sort of a clear barometer for what allyship looks like in this moment, making clear and understanding that there are people who are actually showing up for us, even if they're not saying every single word that each of us would say if we were in their shoes, I think is important, but particularly on the national level, understanding the ways in which this administration and the federal government writ large has really rallied to the moment and continued to show up for our community is incredibly important.
Jeremy or Ty?
Sure.
In terms of more, I guess, on the on the state and local level, and it seems like there's sort of a pyramid of these things that sort of, when you go towards the top, when you go towards Washington and national politics and even state representatives, I think it's much clearer sort of that people are in line, sort of as Amy said, and as you get sort of farther down, that's where it's within the city councils that you see more of there's a bit.
I'm not sure I would agree with that. I would not with that framing precisely, and I appreciate Ty teeing me up a little bit, and we do this a bit because he's got his people with a bridge, I've got my people with a bridge, he's got the Bay Bridge, mine was practically a footbridge from Boston to Cambridge, nobody paid attention, but we're very conscious of what goes on in each other's cities. But I think a lot of the attention, and it's the nature of our world right now, the nature of social media, both that the most extreme voices, the most provocative voices get a lot of attention, and that the way we talk about divisions whether it's in a political body like a city council or within a particular community, it ends up being very like she said, she said. So you get two voices, one on one side of it and one on the other side of it. And so you might have 5 people who are saying something extreme and hateful, and 10,000 people saying something responsible, supportive, collaborative, and it ends up being one quote from each in the coverage. And the result of that is we can obsess a lot about whether it's a couple of members of Congress out of over 500, or more locally, we can get very focused on there's one city councilor who's saying ridiculous, hateful things or is tweeting unacceptable content. And we have definitely had those moments. And frankly, we should pay attention to that because we should not allow that kind of hateful speech to be mainstreamed. So when a Boston city councilor gets up in a city council meeting and makes a hateful anti-Semitic speech filled with tropes, we and our local ADL regional office both made statements. It was picked up in the papers. Wasn't necessarily had a significant impact on her reelection, frankly, because she kind of was running against only nominal opposition. But we felt the obligation to stand up and say that. But that's one city councilor. The flip side of that, and this is where Ty pointed out last night, you know, the Democratic Socialists of America have been trying for years to get Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is notoriously self-proclaimingly progressive in its politics, to endorse BDS, to endorse anti-Israel statements. They took another shot this weekend and they filed what we call public order to call for a ceasefire. The issue for many of us in the Jewish community is not specifically the call for ceasefire, which while we do not support that language and we are very capable of articulating all the concerns, it was how they did it without condemning Hamas, with equating the hostages with prisoners of war. There was a lot of problems with it that went beyond the specific, we support a ceasefire. And everybody's like,
also, I don't believe that the City Council of Cambridge can actually enforce a ceasefire. I don't believe they have a military to.
There's a much longer conversation about all city councils who want to weigh in on foreign policy and whether that's a good use of their time. But what's important here is that, sure, a bunch of people showed up, and sure, all 100, probably every single member of DSA Greater Boston showed up to testify. But at the end of the day, the council voted 2 in favor and 7 against adopting this resolution. And so we see this over and over again. The attention is on the division, and yet the vast majority of local and state elected officials are stepping up in all the ways we would want them to step up, as allies, as partners. And if anything, at least I think for our team, where we have felt very busy, we felt very busy in many ways, and I think every CRC in the country has been just inundated over the last 6 weeks. One of the ways that it's been very busy has been that these local leaders, these local elected officials, these local members of clergy from other communities are reaching out to us and saying, I'm seeing your pain. I want to be supportive. What do you need me to say? Or how can I say it in a way that's helpful? And that's very retail, having all those individual conversations, but that's what we want from our partners, that they want to know how to hold us and how to support us.
I can take the next question, Judah. I couldn't have said it better than Jeremy.
Okay. I guess one thing sort of going forward with that, I mean, you're saying people are reaching out and saying, you know, we see that you're in pain and, you know, how can we help? I mean, time to a certain extent is not necessarily in the Jewish community's favor on that side of things. I think you can already see, you know, as this war goes on, as more and more pictures come out from Gaza, those sympathies start, you know, potentially start to shift, and people forget October 7th because that was a month and a half ago. And also I heard that some of it's made up, and, you know, suddenly it gets lost over time. So I guess, how do you maintain those relations going forward?
Well, there is no purer argument than bringing our hostages home. And, you know, when we talk about human rights and we talk about all these global agencies that have forgotten the Jewish children buried, you know, 5 stories underground, we have to remind them as to why this war started and why it's still going on. Now, we're all crossing our fingers about this, you know, tentative ceasefire deal where we return the women and children. But we also know that this is Hamas, so we can't be sure. Look, the humanitarian toll is devastating. And the first thing I would encourage anyone watching, if you are talking with a local elector or anything else and they ask you about the humanitarian toll, recognize it. Start there. Don't, it's sort of tempting to defend ourselves by saying, well, those numbers are from Hamas. They are from Hamas. But even if you lob off a zero, it's too many dead children and too many dead Gazan civilians. But you have to remind them, like, look, like, we're deeply upset also. But Hamas isn't fighting the IDF in an open field. If it was, there wouldn't be a single dead civilian. They're using human shields. And we're trying to liberate the Gazan civilians from this terrorist organization also, and we need our hostages home. What would the US do in this situation? So I think it's better to ask questions than it is to argue. And I also think that you have to start your response with empathy and validate those concerns about the humanitarian disaster, whether they're being manipulated on screen or not by whatever news station we don't like. So that's where we always start the conversation. It's why we continue to do, empty Shabbat tables and the hostage posters. We've been paying for digital billboards with Bring Them Home, on highway overpasses around the Bay Area. I think that it's our strongest core argument. But I also think that we have a second conversation that is not time specific around anti-Semitism, because we know that this spike is going to last far beyond the end of whatever this conflict's resolution looks like. This is going to be a permanent increase, just like it was 2.5 years ago after May 2021. We've seen the data. It's been dramatically up ever since. Our JCRC ran a Jewish identity survey a year ago that we're now in the field repeating in this moment to show our Bay Area community's experiences with anti-Semitism in different arenas, whether it's progressive politics, schools, universities, local city council, or their workplace. We want to track how comfortable people are in those different settings so that we can bring that data to different elected officials, leaders in schools, et cetera, and show that there are extremely negative trends going on here and give them concrete ways to support our community. And the difference between the JCRC field and other important national organizations, we approach our work with a relationship mindset and a longitudinal mindset. We're not, SEAL Team 6 where we swoop in, we get the job done, and we go back home. We want to be there for the long haul. And to get to this point about, how aggressive should the JCRCs be right now, we need to be incredibly firm. But at the same time, we need these relationships for the next issue and the issue after that. And unfortunately, I foresee a long-term trend of spiking anti-Semitism far beyond the memory of what's happening right now. And so we need to hold on to those relationships, even if it involves civil disagreement, because we're going to need that relationship with that superintendent the next time there's a swastika drawn in school or the next time a Jewish kid feels alienated by curriculum. So that's always the balancing act that we have to maintain doing this work. But yes, there's the conversation about the war that's ever moving quickly, but there's this more evergreen issue in front of us of rising anti-Semitism.
So I'll sort of take that as an opportunity to segue a little bit to one of the places where we've particularly seen a very notable and sort of well-documented rise in anti-Semitism, which is college campuses. Obviously there's other organizations that are at play in this mix as well, Hillel, ADL in some cases, Chabad, but where this falls for you guys going forward, I think one of the main areas that we spoke about also for the article, but one of the areas that a lot of energy and a lot of money has been put into has been in student groups and trying to raise up students. And now, while that is certainly a major part of it, I think while there's certainly some universities whose administrations and administrators have handled this better than others, a lot have sort of fallen down on the job to a certain extent and either, put out mealy-mouthed things or, tried to pepper over anti-Semitism and both sides it and, sometimes not even use the word anti-Semitism, just refer to, disturbances on campus and people feeling uncomfortable. Where you guys see your work going forward specifically on college campuses. And in terms of wanting to maintain those relationships on the one hand, but also, if there's a particular professor, a particular administrator who is permitting, anti-Semitism, do you see it as your responsibility to try to get them out of that position? Jeremy,
yeah.
if Amy, you want to start, yeah.
I was going to say, I'll say very briefly, just sort of on the national level, this has been where a lot of, our advocacy and conversations has been alongside some of the other cabinet secretary meetings and conversations we've had, but particularly in our meetings with the Department of Ed, we've made clear that we need very specific, clear guidance for not just universities and colleges, but K through 12 schools, making clear that administrators, that faculty know exactly what their obligations are in this moment. In addition to not just empowering them, providing them the resources to actually grapple with anti-Semitism appropriately on campus, but sort of the flip side, the stick approach, which is that making sure that we are sufficiently resourcing OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, which is where Title VI complaints as they relate to anti-Semitism and other violations of students' civil rights go. And so there needs to be this dual approach, which is precisely what on the national level we have been advocating for. And I know Jeremy and Ty have been sort of living this on a day-to-day basis in their own relationships and work with local schools.
Well, if ever there's a reminder that Boston is a college town, this last 6 weeks has been pretty heavy in that regard. And I think, Judah, you pointed out already that, a lot of investment has been made by the Jewish community on campus across the country. And there are so many layers of this. And let's think of it like a Venn diagram of the investment in students, whether that's Jewish students or pro-Israel students, those aren't the same thing, or the Jewish student experience and all of those spaces that are student-oriented. There's a whole other space of the investment in faculty. And frankly, I think that's one where nobody's pointed out to me the magic bullet on trends in the American academy on the faculty level that are problematic in some places, in some disciplines. And then there is the administrations. And I think one of the things we've really seen over the last 6 weeks, and I say this with humility as a local JCRC, there's a limited impact we can make with the student experience, say, because there's so much resources pouring in from all sorts of national philanthropists. But there's a critical role for the local community, the same kind of critical role we play with state and local government, with local clergy, not the national denominations, which is campus administrations and the culture of administrations about the kind of campus they want to have. And it's certainly an area that I think we and many Jewish communities need to be more invested in at a local level. And we are taking a critical look at that. And we should take a critical look at these things. Not everything has been great. It would be false to say everything's been great the last 6 weeks. There are things to learn about how we poured in huge resources and have spent decades investing in certain spaces, and there was still real problems. And I think that's a national conversation that as we start to shift away from the reactive 6 weeks urgent moment, we've got to do a little reflection and evaluation about some of that. But certainly one of the things we're seeing is that we need to do as a local JCRC with our partners across the Jewish community, more attention giving to the administration as a relationship that we can all hold as a Jewish community locally. And I will just say, and I'll pass it to Ty, on the K through 12 space, this has been a growing problem. As Ty says, things happen in San Francisco and then the rest of the nation gets them, often Boston next, or vice versa. And there has been an ongoing issue about how does the Jewish community invest in our relationship with public schools. We very much have been following what's been going on in the Bay Area and have been working on a model to launch an initiative here around our investment in building a relationship with school administrators, leaders, faculty, and frankly, those who are responsible for classroom-facing materials at the K through 12 public space. We were planning to launch it at the end of October. We've been working on this for 18 months, and we really modeled it after what they've already been doing in San Francisco. We ended up moving that up a couple of weeks, given the realities of the last few weeks, but given that we very much have been learning from Ty, I think Ty is more qualified than I to speak to sort of some of the history that they've had in this space.
It's probably too early for a gin and tonic, Jeremy, so I don't know about that. But what I will say is that, we've been having a lot of challenges with this whole ethnic studies curriculum business in California. And now it's, I believe, in 18 states across the country. I think that one of our takeaways that we knew far before October 7th is that we need to invest much more heavily into the K-12 space. You have you sort of have a two-front fight. One is the curriculum fight, which is what's taught in the classroom, what's allowed to be taught. And the other is the environmental fight. The latter, I think, being what we've seen most prevalent in terms of challenges since October 7th. You know, Jewish kids not feeling safe in their schools, Gaza walkouts where, you know, in one school district, kids were banging on doors saying, "Bring out your Jews." You know, this is horrifying. And I think more often than not, principals, administrators want to support our community. They don't know how. You know, they're not qualified, or they're not trained, or they're not familiar with this level of tension within their student population, and they don't have the tools to resolve it. And so as frustrating it is when this is your kid that's dealing with these issues, it's important to recognize about 8 or 9 times out of 10, it's a lack of experience and it's a lack of education that these decision makers in public schools are dealing with. And so we started bringing them to Israel along with our LA Federation, doing a statewide California leadership trip for superintendents and school board members. And we plan to hire up, you know, in the next few months to few years of more professionals in the education space, because we can't allow you know, in our universities, anti-Semitism is a feature, not a bug. We can't allow that to happen in our K-12 schools. And if we are not prepared, and if we're not investing in education community relations, that could be where we're headed. And so that's where we're going to be spending much more of our attention moving forward.
So we're going to sort of pause here on my side. I will actually, before we get, I have sort of one more question, and then we'll start bringing in some of the questions from the audience. You know, one of the things that some colleagues of mine at Jewish Insider have noted recently, and I think other people have noted recently, is there's this knee-jerk need to you can't, that you know, especially for national politicians, for the Biden administration, there's a certain inability to say fighting anti-Semitism without also saying and fighting Islamophobia. And there's sort of these two things having to be connected to one another, which I think on the one hand, you know, it runs the risk of all lives mattering anti-Semitism. And on the other hand, sort of puts Jews and Muslims, that this is a Jewish-Muslim war that's happening in Israel, and sort of puts Jews and Muslims against one another, that it has to be one and the other, that we're two sides. And sort of this knee-jerk, and it also happens a little bit within the Jewish community that there's a lot of, we also are aware of Islamophobia, and there's this sort of unwillingness to say there's rising anti-Semitism. We have crazy numbers to back it up of 300, 400, 500%, depending on sort of where and who you're asking. So how are you guys able to navigate that space and sort of wanting to put anti-Semitism where it should be? Yeah.
Well, let me start with what we shouldn't be doing. And that's, we shouldn't be keeping a score sheet of who's oppressed more. That is a losing battle. It's something that is only going to alienate our allies if we say, look, they did it. And it reinforces to those that were frustrated lumping everything together that we're just two communities, like two schoolyard, you know, kids getting into a fight that need to be separated. That is not the way to handle this. There are times where it is appropriate and not appropriate to combine it. And that's the kind of nuanced conversation that we need to have from the federal level on down. You know, we need to recognize that our Muslim neighbors are hurting and they are being scapegoated, and we need to be empathetic to that while having sharp disagreements with their policy priorities for the region. You know, we've been doing joint trainings with Muslim DEI practitioners because they too have been left out of a lot of DEI curriculum. Even though Jewish identity and Muslim identity are very different, there's a lot of parallel frustration in the Muslim community where the Jewish community is also left out, and that we found that as a great opportunity for partnership with Muslim practitioners to fill those gaps together. Do we agree on Israel-Palestine? No, but we still think it's an important way for us to show that both of our communities are scapegoated for events overseas, and that ultimately we need to make sure that our interests in this country are protected. At the same time, these two systems of oppression work very differently. And if you're always putting them together, you're actually reinforcing to the public that these are two communities that have to be at odds. It's like they are underscoring the very problem that we're trying to uproot, that Muslims and Jews don't disagree on everything, that we aren't at odds about everything. And we don't want that, you know, two schoolyard, you know, kids in a fight need to be separated notion. And when they put that out as a default, it looks that way. And that's highly problematic to us, especially as we try to even behind closed doors, if it's not always possible to speak out publicly, we do have private relationships with Muslim leaders, and we're trying to navigate things to lower the tensions in our communities so we don't see more incidents like the murder of Paul Kessler in Thousand Oaks. And so we need to explain to our elected leaders, civic leaders, education officials, here's when it is appropriate to do this, and here's where it's entirely inappropriate, where your all lives mattering our experience, and you're devaluing Jewish life in your constituency, whatever it might be.
Jeremy, you had eyebrows when I asked that question, so I want you to give a response.
It's actually something the three of us have been talking about in the last week or so, and I know we all have something to say about this, and would love to hear from Amy. Look, I think it's important. I agree with everything Ty said. I think it's also important to say it's legitimate that members of our community are expressing certain frustrations in some moments when you see a question directed towards some public leader about anti-Semitism, and they barely get through a sentence before they pivot to talking about other hates, including Islamophobia. That is not to take away from the importance of addressing all forms of hate. And Ty said as well, but I think we have to acknowledge that there is some frustration in some very high-profile moments the last 6 weeks when people haven't been able, it seems, to explicitly, clearly just say anti-Semitism is a problem, hard stop, and then talk about how in a society where various hates, extremism, bigotries are allowed to rise, Jews are impacted in a particular way as Jews that is specific. So I think we have to hold that conversation. I've seen it myself in the last few weeks, where you have to actually literally go back and point out that the same public official who said something about Islamophobia one day also said something about anti-Semitism the day before. And it's coming at a time that our community is incredibly vulnerable. And let's just acknowledge that. We're all vulnerable. We're all seeing the worst in people, including the worst in people that we assume were better. So we're just having this sort of reaction to it that may be at times a little bit losing the larger scope of the President of the United States has a national agenda on, there's a national White House initiative on anti-Semitism. It doesn't take away from that if he's also saying, let's have a national initiative on Islamophobia. It doesn't take away from a national effort to fight anti-Semitism to say homophobia is also a problem in this country. And it presents in a different way. And I think we can do that.
Yeah. And I think underscoring Jeremy's last point about the fact that this is not zero sum, right? Fighting Islamophobia does not take away from fighting anti-Semitism. That doesn't mean that we need to say both of those terms in every breath, every time we're dealing with an instance of hate. If there is an act of anti-Semitism, we should be calling it out as anti-Semitism, clear and simple, full stop. But also at this moment, we are dealing with a variety of hate that long predated October 7th. We are seeing how these forms of hate are deeply interconnected. We are also seeing how in this moment, even though anti-Semitism is far outpacing other forms of hate right now, there are very real threats against the Muslim and the Arab American community, right? A 6-year-old boy was murdered. A student at Stanford was run over by a car. A professor at American University was threatened at his office with death threats. So those are very real threats that warrant action, even as we grapple with skyrocketing, unprecedented anti-Semitism. And how we hold all of this, right? How we not fall prey to efforts to turn this into some sort of zero-sum game. This competitive victimhood that so often takes root in moments like this that says that, calling out one form of hate somehow comes at the expense of another, is crucial, because it's not the Jewish community and it's not the Muslim community that are at odds with one another. It's the extremists in all direction who are trying to pit our communities against one another, that are going to make all of us less safe. So it's so crucial that we not fall prey to that zero-sum approach, that we be clear about the very real threats as they're manifesting right now, including the unprecedented rise of anti-Semitism, but also understand that, of course, other communities are living in fear and pain right now, including and especially the Muslim and the Arab American community, given the very real threats that they've seen. So that's why we at JCPA, in partnership with the JCRCs, including Ty and Jeremy, put forward a statement last month signed by 160 Jewish organizations unequivocally rejecting Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate, making clear that those who are spreading that hate sort of in the name of our community or in any other way are not speaking for us. And it's important to be clear about that, again, while still not losing sight about the very real threats that we ourselves are facing right now. And so I think really one of the key takeaways in all of our work over the last 6 to 7 weeks is that the false binaries, the zero-sum approach that so often comes into play in moments like this, only makes us less safe. And how we can avoid those false binaries, how we could not fall prey to that zero-sum game is going to be all the more crucial in the weeks and months ahead, not simply because of the ongoing impact of this direct conflict, but as Ty talked about, the fact that anti-Semitism, broader hate, and bigotry are going to continue to have very real tailwinds that we're going to need to grapple with as a Jewish community.
If I may add something else, I think it's also important, and Amy referenced the joint statement that JCPA organized, and we were very grateful to them for creating that space for all of us to address this in a thoughtful way. It's really important that we not lose ourselves in this moment. And so, yes, there is an aspect of what we all do, and we've talked about knowing who our allies are, knowing who is not an ally, making sure that extremists are not allowed to be mainstream from the left or from the right in our politics. All of that is true. And there's certainly some element of keeping track of who did not stand with us in this moment. But we also don't want to lose our own humanity and our own Jewish humanity because of the failures of others. So, for example, when that statement was organized, there was somebody in our community who, asked me, so have you kept track of how many Muslim organizations have condemned anti-Semitism in the last week? This is just a week after October 7th. And I said to him directly, honestly, I haven't really done that. And I'm not sure it really matters, because our commitment to fighting racism, bigotry, to fighting for the idea of America as a place where it is safe for us to be Jews isn't lost because somebody else falls short, so to speak. And I think that's a really important part of this, is that we want to continue to aspire to be the kinds of Jews we want to be. And if we start saying things like, well, all the leaders in some other community are anti-Semitic, so let's be racist, sexist, homophobic, bigoted, blah, 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 then we're allowing their problems and their shortcomings to define our core as Jews. And we don't want to do that either.
All right. So just a question from the audience. Sort of all of this having been said, and about some of the successes and strengths of the coalition model that you all see, do you guys feel that there have been some fundamental flaws in those policies and in those strategies that have been exposed, that you guys now need to go back and sort of reassess and reshape going forward?
Look, I think there are places that we definitely need to put more emphasis. I reject the premise that there is an entire community that we should write off. It feels a little racist to me, quite frankly. But it may mean that we have the wrong partners in that community, and then we have to figure out who are the ones that we can have a working relationship, reciprocal relationship, not transactional, but a friendship is something that is two ways, right? And if we're not getting that, it may be that we don't have the right partners in that community. But I sort of reject the premise that, is community relations working? I would say that our field has been under-resourced for a long time, and we need more resources. Jeremy and I are lucky that we are strong JCRCs that are resourced with full teams. But what about all of our small to mid-sized towns across the country that have 0 to a half-time professional that are doing this work and are spread very thin? And so to that, I would say we need to train our lay people to get involved with politics, to build relationships with elected officials, to get involved with multi-faith coalitions. We need to work on leadership development for community relations. So regardless of how many professionals you have in your city, our lay people know how to do the work with us. And we have not been focused nearly enough on that, let alone making sure that the community relations field now that we have a national agency, JCPA, led by an incredible leader in Amy Spitalnick, we have a strong JCPA, and I think the entire country needs to, is waking up to the urgency of the importance of these longitudinal relationships. So I think the question in my mind is, where do we invest our energy? And how can we make sure outside of our two cities with strong JCRCs that our colleagues have the resources that they need? Because it's not just San Francisco and Boston that are a future of the country, that are producing future members of Congress, right? This needs to be something happening everywhere across our country. And so I want to be a cheerleader along with everybody on this call for making sure that we can strengthen our field in the months and years ahead.
Yes to what Ty said, and I'm going to give it to Amy for the last word, because we are very lucky and fortunate that Amy has now joined our field. We need strong, thoughtful, effective national leadership to make the case for the CRC field, and we're very lucky to finally have that after a fairly long period without it.
Thanks. I feel like I'm just shooting myself in the foot if I say anything beyond those fantastic words from Ty and Jeremy. But look, really grateful for Ty and Jeremy's leadership, particularly over the last 6 to 7 weeks, but of course, long before that. And to their points, we're in a moment where the urgency of community relations has sort of been laid bare, and how we are resourcing community relations work across the country in a way that empowers, that engages, that helps people find those right partners across communities rather than writing off entire communities in moments like this is crucial. And so that's precisely what we're going to be doing at JCPA. We are building out work specifically focused on empowering not just professionals, but lay people, building those relationships around issues of democracy and fighting hate, including anti-Semitism and its deep interconnectedness with other forms of hate, helping people understand why Jewish safety is inherent to their own safety and to the inclusive, pluralistic societies we all need. And so that is what we are building out in the weeks and months ahead in close partnership with Jeremy and Ty and so many other phenomenal JCRC leaders around the country, many of whom are on this call as well. And I'm just so grateful to get to be in this work, certainly a challenging moment to be starting it, but it's one in which it has never been more urgent. And so if nothing else, the last 6 weeks have certainly made that clear.
All right. Leslie?
Sure. Wow. Thank you all for being with us today. This was clearly a conversation that can and will go on. Many really thoughtful questions came to us, and we hope to be able to follow up with you either with another one of these conversations or in direct conversation with each of you. I want to especially thank Judah, Amy, Jeremy, and Ty for an illuminating and critical conversation. In this time of turmoil, pain, and grief, the field of community relations can play a unique role in bringing our communities together and deserve our support. The resources are really necessary. Despite, in many cases, profound differences, we have the ability to find common ground and work together in coalition to address the many issues that are impacting our communities. A recording of today's program will be on our websites shortly. We encourage you to share it with others, and we invite you to explore the individual websites for each of our JCRCs and the JCPA for upcoming work. Our website addresses can be found in the chat. Thank you all again for joining. We're wishing you a peaceful and restorative Thanksgiving.